The charcoal felt familiar between Georgia Turner's fingers as she sat beneath the wooden awning of the general store, her sketchbook balanced on her knees, capturing the lean figure of the cowboy standing across the dusty main street of Tucumcari, New Mexico. She had arrived in town 3 weeks ago with her brother's family, seeking respite from the humid chaos of St. Louis, and had found herself mesmerized by the raw, unpolished beauty of the frontier and the men who inhabited it. This particular cowboy had become her favorite subject over the past 5 days, though she had been careful to remain unnoticed, tucked in the shadows while he went about his business at the livery stable, his movements confident and purposeful beneath the relentless August sun of 1878. Georgia pressed the charcoal harder against the paper, darkening the shadow beneath the brim of his hat, trying to capture the angle of his jaw and the set of his shoulders as he checked the cinch on a saddle. She estimated him to be in his mid-20s, not much older than her own 22 years, and there was something about the economy of his movements that spoke of competence and quiet strength. Her fingers worked quickly, sketching the line of his back, the way his dusty trousers sat on his hips, the scuffed leather of his boots. "You have been drawing me for 5 days now," a voice said, and George's head snapped up so fast her neck cracked. The cowboy stood directly in front of her, blocking out the afternoon sun, his eyes hidden beneath the shadow of his hat, but his mouth curved in what might have been amusement. "I noticed you the first day." Heat flooded Georgia's face, and she clutched her sketchbook to her chest, mortified. "I apologize. I did not mean to be intrusive. I should have asked permission." He pushed his hat back with one finger, revealing eyes the color of weathered denim striking against his sun-bronzed skin. "Did not say I minded. Just figured if you were going to keep at it, might as well get the details right." He extended his hand. "Quentin Xavier." She hesitated, then reached out to shake his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm. "Georgia Turner." "Draw me again, but closer this time," Quentin said, settling himself on the bench beside her without waiting for an invitation. "Seems a waste for you to squint from across the street when I am willing to sit." Georgia's heart hammered in her chest as she opened her sketchbook again, acutely aware of his proximity, the smell of leather and sage and honest sweat. "You do not have to do this. I know." He adjusted his position, angling his body slightly toward her. "But I have been curious about what you have been seeing that keeps you coming back. Most folks do not look at anything in this town long enough to really see it." She picked up her charcoal with trembling fingers, studying his face properly for the first time. Up close, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting against the sun, a small scar cutting through his left eyebrow, the precise shape of his mouth. "I see a lot," she said quietly. "This place is beautiful in a way St. Louis never was." St. Louis. He did not move as she began to sketch, holding himself still with the patience of someone accustomed to long hours in the saddle. "What brings you west?" "My brother Walter married a woman from Santa Fe. They settled here last year, and he wrote asking if I would come help with their new baby." George's hand moved across the page, capturing the strong line of his nose, the angle of his cheekbones. "I was teaching at a girls' school, but the opportunity to see the territories was too appealing to pass up." "You planning to stay?" "I do not know yet." She glanced up, meeting his eyes, and found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Are you from Tucumcari?" "No. Grew up on a ranch outside Amarillo. Came here 6 months ago looking for work. The livery owner, Mr. Hutchins, needed someone who knew horses." He shifted slightly. "You are good at this. Thank you." Georgia added shading beneath his jaw, trying to capture the play of light and shadow on his face. "Have you sat for an artist before?" "Never. Did not figure anyone would want to draw someone like me." "Why not?" The question came out before she could stop it, genuine confusion in her voice. Quentin was quiet for a moment. I work with my hands. I smell like horses most days. I am not exactly the kind of subject for a portrait. You are wrong. Georgia's charcoal moved faster now, confidence building as she lost herself in the work. You have one of the most interesting faces I have ever drawn. There is character in every line, history in the way you hold yourself. Art is not just for drawing society ladies in their parlors. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. That's so, absolutely. She added detail to his shirt collar, the worn fabric of his vest. The human form in motion, in work, in real life, that is what interests me, not posed artifice. They fell into comfortable silence, Georgia working while Quentin held still, and she found herself hyper-aware of every small detail about him. The way his chest rose and fell with each breath, the slight sunburn on the bridge of his nose, the strength in his hands where they rested on his knees. She had drawn dozens of people over the years, but none had ever made her feel quite like this, as though the air between them carried an electric charge. "Can I see?" Quentin asked when she finally sat back, examining her work with a critical eye. Georgia turned the sketchbook toward him, suddenly nervous about his reaction. She had captured him honestly, not romanticized or softened, but showing the quiet dignity she saw in him. He studied the drawing for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he looked up, something had shifted in his eyes. "Is that really how you see me?" "Yes, you made me look." He trailed off, searching for words. "Like who you are," Georgia finished softly. Quentin handed the sketchbook back carefully, his fingers brushing hers. "Would you have supper with me tomorrow evening? There is a decent restaurant on 3rd Street. Mrs. Chen makes the best dumplings you will ever taste." Georgia's pulse jumped. "I would like that very much." 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock, she agreed. He stood, settling his hat back low on his head, but paused before walking away. "Georgia, thank you for seeing something worth drawing." She watched him cross the street back to the livery, her sketchbook still open on her lap, and realized her hands were shaking. Not from nervousness, but from the sudden, fierce certainty that something important had just begun. The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Georgia helped her sister-in-law Margaret with the washing, minded her infant nephew Thomas, and tried not to think about the evening ahead, which of course meant she thought of nothing else. Margaret noticed her distraction immediately. "You are in another world today," Margaret said, hanging a wet sheet on the line strung across their small yard. "Something on your mind." Georgia hesitated, then decided there was no point in hiding it. "I am having supper with someone tonight." Margaret's eyebrows shot up. "Oh, who?" "Quentin Xavier. He works at the livery." "The tall one with the blue eyes." Margaret's face lit up with interest. "I have seen him around town. He seems respectable." "How did you meet?" "He caught me drawing him," Georgia admitted, feeling her cheeks warm. "I have been sketching scenes around town, and he has been one of my subjects. He asked if I would have supper with him." Margaret laughed, delighted. "How wonderfully romantic. You must wear your blue dress, the one with the white piping. It brings out your eyes. It is just supper." It is never just supper when a man asks a woman out properly. Margaret pinned another sheet to the line. "Walter will want to know his intentions." "Margaret, please, I have only just met him." But Margaret was already planning, and by the time 6 o'clock approached, Georgia found herself in the blue dress with her dark hair pinned up in a way that was practical yet flattering, her sister-in-law fussing over her like a mother hen. Walter had indeed asked pointed questions about Quentin, but seemed mollified when Georgia assured him that Quentin worked steadily and had been nothing but respectful. Quentin arrived exactly at 6, cleaned up and wearing a pressed shirt that Georgia suspected was his best. His hair was still damp from washing, combed back from his face, and he held his hat in his hands as he greeted Walter and Margaret with perfect politeness. "I will have her home by 9, Quentin said to Walter, who was doing his best impression of a protective older brother. "See that you do," Walter replied gruffly, but his eyes were kind. They walked through the dusty streets of Tucumcari as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Georgia was aware of curious glances from townspeople, the way Mrs. Henderson peered at them from her front porch, but Quentin seemed unbothered, offering her his arm as they navigated around a group of children playing in the street. "You look very nice," Quentin said, glancing at her with an expression that made her stomach flutter. "Thank you. So do you, Mrs. Chen's restaurant was a small establishment tucked between a hardware store and a boarding house, but inside it was warm and welcoming, with red lanterns hanging from the ceiling and the wonderful smell of cooking filling the air. Mrs. Chen herself greeted them, a tiny woman with sharp eyes and a warm smile leading them to a corner table. "You bring lady friend," Mrs. Chen said to Quentin with obvious approval. "Very pretty. I bring you special dinner," Quentin grinned. "That would be perfect, Mrs. Chen, thank you." They were left alone at the table, and Georgia looked around with interest at the unfamiliar decor, the other diners enjoying their meals. "Have you been coming here long, since I arrived in town?" Mrs. Chen and her husband came from San Francisco about 5 years ago. "Her food reminds me that the world is bigger than just cattle and dust." He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about St. Louis. What was it like teaching there?" Georgia considered the question, organizing her thoughts. "Challenging, rewarding. I taught literature and art to girls aged 12 to 17. Some of them were genuinely interested in learning. Others were only there because their families wanted them to acquire polish before marriage." She traced a pattern on the table with her finger. "I loved the teaching itself, but I felt constrained by the expectations. There were so many rules about what was proper to teach, how to present information. I wanted to show my students that the world was vast and full of possibilities, but the school administration wanted me to prepare them to be decorative wives. You did not agree with that vision. No, I believe women are capable of far more than society allows." She met his eyes. "Does that bother you?" "Why would it?" Quentin asked, seeming genuinely puzzled. "My mother ran our ranch after my father died. She did the books, managed the hands, made all the decisions. I grew up knowing women were just as capable as men, sometimes more so. She would have liked you." "Would have. She passed 2 years ago, pneumonia." The pain was still evident in his voice. "I sold the ranch after. Could not bear to stay there without her. I am so sorry." Georgia reached across the table instinctively, covering his hand with hers. "That must have been terrible." He turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers, and the simple gesture felt momentous. "It was the worst thing I have ever been through, but she taught me well, to work hard, to treat people with respect, to find beauty where you can." He squeezed her hand gently. "I think she would have said drawing was finding beauty." Mrs. Chen arrived with plates of dumplings, noodles, and vegetables in savory sauce, forcing them to separate their hands, but the warmth of the connection lingered. The food was indeed exceptional, and they ate while talking, the conversation flowing easily from topic to topic. Quentin told her about growing up on the ranch, learning to ride before he could properly walk, the vast Texas sky he had loved. Georgia described St. Louis, the Mississippi River, the cultural opportunities she had enjoyed, but also the suffocating social expectations. "You miss it?" Quentin asked, expertly using his chopsticks in a way that suggested he had been eating here regularly. "Parts of it. The museums, the concerts, the libraries. But not the rest of it. not the feeling that every move I made was being judged and measured against some impossible standard of propriety. Georgia tried to use her chopsticks, fumbled, and laughed at herself. I am terrible at this. Here. Quentin reached over, adjusting her fingers on the chopsticks, his touch gentle but sure. Hold them like this. The bottom one stays still, the top one moves. With his guidance, she managed to pick up a dumpling, triumphant. I did it. His smile was brilliant. Quick learner. They lingered over the meal, neither wanting the evening to end, and when they finally stepped back out into the night air, the sky was full of stars, more than Georgia had ever seen in the gas-lit streets of St. Louis. She stopped, tilting her head back to look up at the vast sweep of the Milky Way. Oh, she breathed. It is magnificent. Quentin stood beside her, looking up as well. One of the things I love about the West, the sky goes on forever. I could never capture this in a drawing. The scale is too immense. Maybe some things are meant to just be experienced, not captured. He looked down at her, his face soft in the starlight. Though I am glad you tried to capture me. They walked slowly back toward Walter and Margaret's house, taking the long route through town, neither ready for the evening to end. Quentin told her about the horses at the livery, describing each one's personality with obvious affection. Georgia talked about the sketches she had been working on, her observations of frontier life. Would you show me your other drawings sometime? Quentin asked. I would like to see what else you have been noticing about Tucumcari. I would be happy to. Georgia hesitated, then added, would you like to come to Sunday dinner this weekend? Margaret mentioned she was planning to invite you. Did she now? Quentin's tone was amused. She may have decided she approved of you, and your brother, Walter, will come around. He is protective, but he is reasonable. They reached the house too soon, stopping at the front gate. Quentin held his hat in his hands, looking down at her with an expression that made her heart race. I had a wonderful time tonight, Georgia said softly. So did I. He reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. Can I see you again before Sunday? I would like that. Tomorrow, I could take you out to see some of the country around town. There is a place I know, a canyon with rock formations that you might want to draw. That sounds perfect. He smiled, and then, moving slowly enough that she could pull away if she wanted, he leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. Good night, Georgia. Good night, Quentin. She watched him walk away, one hand pressed to where his lips had touched her skin, feeling as though she were glowing from the inside out. Margaret appeared at the door the moment Georgia stepped inside, eyes bright with curiosity. Well, Georgia could not help the smile that spread across her face. It was wonderful. Over the following weeks, Georgia and Quentin fell into a pattern of spending time together whenever his work at the livery allowed. He took her out to the canyon he had mentioned, and she spent hours sketching the striated rock formations while he sat nearby, reading a book he had borrowed from the town's small lending library. They had picnics in the shade of cottonwood trees along the creek, attended a barn dance where Quentin proved to be a surprisingly good dancer, and spent long evenings sitting on Walter and Margaret's porch, talking until the stars came out. Georgia learned that Quentin had educated himself through voracious reading, that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh, that he was respected by everyone in town for his fairness and reliability. Quentin discovered that Georgia had a stubborn streak a mile wide, that she could discuss philosophy and politics with the same passion she brought to art, that she cried at beautiful sunsets, and had a tendency to gesture wildly when excited about a topic. Walter and Margaret watched the courtship with approval, though Walter still occasionally subjected Quentin to pointed questions about his prospects and intentions. Quentin bore it with good humor, understanding that it came from love and protectiveness. One September evening, as they sat by the creek watching the water flow past, Quentin turned to Georgia with unusual seriousness. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice quiet. Georgia set aside her sketchbook, giving him her full attention. "What is it?" "Mr. Hutchins has offered to make me a partner in the livery. He wants to expand, maybe add a smithy, and he says he trusts me to help run things." Quentin picked up a smooth stone, turning it over in his hands. "It would mean I have real prospects here, a future beyond just working for wages." "Quentin, that is wonderful." Georgia reached for his hand, squeezing it. "You must be thrilled." "I am. But it also means I am committed to staying in Tucumcari long term." He met her eyes. "I need to know if that matters to you, if you are planning to go back to St. Louis." Georgia's heart began to race. "Are you asking me to stay?" "I am asking if you want to stay. Because I am falling in love with you, Georgia, and I need to know if there is any chance you feel the same way." The world seemed to hold its breath. Georgia looked at this man who had come into her life so unexpectedly, who saw her as she truly was and valued it, who made her laugh and think and feel things she had never felt before. "I am already in love with you," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion surging through her. "I have been for weeks." The relief and joy on Quentin's face was almost overwhelming. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. "Can I kiss you properly now, please?" she whispered. He kissed her as the creek burbled past, and the cottonwood leaves rustled overhead, and it felt like coming home to a place she had never been before. His lips were warm and gentle, then more insistent as she responded, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," Quentin said. "I know it is fast, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. Marry me, Georgia." "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, absolutely yes." He kissed her again, and then they were both laughing, giddy with happiness and relief and the sheer rightness of it all. They stayed by the creek until the stars came out, making plans and dreaming aloud about the future they would build together. Walter was shocked when they announced their engagement the next day, but Margaret just smiled knowingly and hugged them both. "I knew from the first supper," she said, "the way you looked at each other." "We have only known each other 2 months," Walter protested, though his tone suggested he was not truly opposed. "I knew I wanted to marry Margaret after 3 weeks," Quentin pointed out. "Sometimes you just know." Walter could not argue with that logic, having indeed courted Margaret in a whirlwind romance himself. He shook Quentin's hand firmly. "You treat her right, or you answer to me." "I intend to spend every day of the rest of my life treating her exactly as she deserves," Quentin said seriously. They decided to wait until early November for the wedding, giving Georgia time to make a dress, and allowing Quentin to finalize the partnership with Mr. Hutchins and find a small house for them to rent. The weeks flew by in a flurry of preparations, and Georgia found herself happier than she had ever been, even as she dealt with the logistics of writing to her parents in St. Louis to inform them of her engagement. Her mother's response was predictably shocked and disapproving. Georgia was marrying a livery worker, a man with no family connections or social standing, and doing it in a dusty frontier town instead of having a proper St. Louis wedding. But her father's letter was kinder, saying that if Georgia had found someone who made her happy and treated her well, that was all that truly mattered. He sent a small amount of money as a wedding gift, with instructions to use it however they saw fit. "Your father sounds like a good man," Quentin said when Georgia read him the letter. "He is. I wish you could meet him. Maybe someday we will travel to St. Louis and I can meet your whole family properly." "Maybe," Georgia agreed, though she suspected her mother would never truly accept Quentin, and that saddened her. The house Quentin found was small but charming, with 2 bedrooms, a front room, and a kitchen with a good stove. It needed work, and they spent evenings painting and repairing, making it ready for their life together. Georgia hung curtains she sewed herself, and Quentin built shelves for her books and art supplies. Margaret donated some furniture, and Mrs. Chen gave them a set of beautiful teacups as an early wedding gift. "It is starting to look like a real home," Georgia said one evening, surveying their handiwork with satisfaction. Quentin came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Our home." She leaned back against him, feeling safe and cherished. "I cannot wait to start our life here." The wedding took place on a crisp November morning in the small church at the edge of town. Georgia wore a cream-colored dress she had made herself, with lace at the collar and cuffs that Margaret had contributed from her own wedding dress. She carried a bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers that Quentin had ridden out to pick at dawn, wanting her to have something beautiful. The guest list was small, mostly townspeople who had become friends, but their warmth and genuine happiness for the couple made up for the absence of George's family. Walter walked his sister down the aisle, and Margaret stood up as George's attendant, while Mr. Hutchins served as Quentin's best man. When the minister asked Quentin to recite his vows, his voice was strong and sure. "I, Quentin Xavier, take you, Georgia Turner, to be my wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." Georgia repeated her own vows, her eyes locked on Quentin's, meaning every word with her whole heart. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Quentin's kiss was tender and full of promise. The reception was held at Mrs. Chen's restaurant, which she had closed to regular customers for the occasion. There was food and music and dancing, and Georgia found herself passed from partner to partner as the men of Tucumcari took turns dancing with the bride. But her eyes always found Quentin across the room, and the warmth in his gaze never faltered. As evening fell, they walked to their little house as husband and wife, and Quentin carried Georgia over the threshold despite her laughing protests that it was silly. He set her down gently in their front room, now lit by the oil lamps he had left burning before the ceremony. "Hello, Mrs. Xavier," he said softly. "Hello, Mr. Xavier," she replied, reaching up to loosen his tie. He caught her hands, bringing them to his lips and kissing each palm. "Are you happy?" deliriously. She smiled up at him. "Are you?" "More than I ever thought possible." He drew her close, and when he kissed her this time, it was with the freedom of knowing they had all the time in the world, all the nights ahead of them. "I love you, Georgia. I love you too." Their wedding night was tender and sweet, full of whispered words and gentle exploration. And when Georgia woke the next morning in Quentin's arms, she felt a bone-deep contentment she had never experienced before. This was where she was meant to be, with this man, building a life in the raw beauty of New Mexico. The first months of their marriage were an adjustment, learning to navigate the rhythms of living together, but they settled into it with surprising ease. Quentin left for the livery early each morning, and Georgia would pack him a lunch before settling into her own work. She had begun taking on commissions, drawing portraits of families and landscapes for people who wanted to preserve memories. Word spread about her talent, and she found herself with a steady stream of clients willing to pay for her services. In the evenings, they would cook dinner together, Quentin's simple ranch cooking combining with techniques Georgia had learned from Mrs. Chen. They would eat and talk about their days, and then often Quentin would read aloud while Georgia sketched, his voice a comforting background as she worked. Sometimes they would go for walks, exploring the town and the surrounding countryside. On Sundays, they attended church and had dinner with Walter and Margaret, watching little Thomas grow and thrive. Winter came to Tucumcari, bringing cold nights and occasional snow, and Georgia and Quentin spent evenings huddled by the fire, wrapped in blankets, planning for the future. The livery partnership was doing well, and Quentin's share of the profits meant they had financial security they had not expected so soon. "I have been thinking," Quentin said one February night as they lay in bed with George's head on his chest, "about expanding into breeding horses, not just boarding and selling them. We have the space behind the livery and I know good bloodlines. It could be profitable." Georgia traced patterns on his chest with one finger. "It sounds like you have been giving this a lot of thought." "I have. I want to build something lasting, something we can pass on." He paused. "I want to give our children a good foundation." She lifted her head to look at him. "Our children, if you want them. I know we have not really talked about it, but I would like to have a family with you." "No pressure, I just wanted you to know that is what I hope for." Georgia kissed him softly. "I want that too, not right away maybe, but yes, I want to have your children." His arms tightened around her. "I am the luckiest man alive." Spring arrived with wildflowers carpeting the plains, and Georgia spent hours sketching the riot of color, trying to capture the way the wind moved through the blooms. She had been feeling tired lately, more emotional than usual, and when she missed her monthly courses for the second time, she began to suspect the reason. Margaret confirmed it, having been through it herself. "You are definitely pregnant," she said, smiling at Georgia's shocked expression. "How do you feel about it?" Terrified, excited, overwhelmed. Georgia pressed a hand to her still flat stomach. "How do I tell Quentin? However you want, but I suspect he will be overjoyed." That evening, Georgia made Quentin's favorite meal and waited until they had finished eating before taking his hand and placing it on her stomach. "There is something I need to tell you." He looked at her, puzzled, and then understanding dawned in his eyes. "Are you?" "I am pregnant. About 2 months along, I think." The joy on his face was incandescent. He stood up, pulling her into his arms and spinning her around before setting her down carefully, as if she were made of glass. "We are having a baby. We are having a baby," she confirmed, laughing at his enthusiasm. He kissed her thoroughly and then dropped to his knees, pressing his face against her stomach. "Hello in there," he said softly. "I am your father and I already love you so much." Georgia's eyes filled with tears, overcome by the sweetness of the moment. She ran her fingers through his hair, marveling at how much her life had changed in less than a year. The pregnancy was not easy. Georgia dealt with morning sickness that lasted well into the afternoon, exhaustion that made it hard to focus on her artwork, and aches and pains that seemed to migrate around her body. But Quentin was endlessly patient and supportive, taking over more of the household tasks, bringing her ginger tea and crackers when her stomach rebelled, rubbing her back when it ached. By summer, her condition was obvious, and the women of Tucumcari rallied around her, sharing advice and hand-me-down baby clothes. Mrs. Chen made special soups that were supposed to strengthen the baby, and Margaret helped Georgia sew tiny gowns and blankets. Quentin read every book about childbirth he could get his hands on, determined to understand what Georgia would be going through. "You do not have to memorize medical texts," Georgia said, amused, as she watched him frown over a particularly dense passage. "I want to be prepared. I want to know how to help you. You help me every day just by being you." She shifted in her chair, trying to find a comfortable position now that her belly was large and unwieldy. "Though I would not say no to another back rub." He set aside the book immediately, moving behind her chair and working his strong fingers into the tight muscles of her lower back. Georgia groaned in relief, leaning into the pressure. "Better," Much better. You are a miracle worker. The baby arrived on a cool October evening, after a labor that lasted 18 hours and left Georgia exhausted and wrung out. But when the midwife placed the squalling infant in her arms, all the pain seemed distant and unimportant. Quentin sat beside the bed, his arm around Georgia's shoulders, staring down at their son with wonder. "He is perfect," Quentin whispered, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny hand with one finger. "What should we name him?" Georgia asked, studying the miniature face, the dark fuzz of hair, the starfish hands. "I have been thinking about that. What about Joseph? After your father," Georgia looked up at him, surprised and touched. "You would do that. He gave me the gift of his daughter. Seems right to honor him." "Joseph Xavier," Georgia said, testing out the name. "I like it." Little Joseph was a good baby, sleeping in reasonable stretches and nursing well, and Georgia found herself falling into the rhythms of motherhood with more ease than she had expected. Quentin was a devoted father, happy to walk the floor with Joseph when he was fussy, to change nappies and give baths, to sing terrible off-key lullabies that somehow soothed the baby anyway. "You are a natural at this," Georgia said one night, watching Quentin rock Joseph to sleep. "He makes it easy. Look at him." Quentin's voice was filled with awe as he gazed down at his son. "We made this person, Georgia. How is that not the most amazing thing in the world?" The first year of Joseph's life flew by in a blur of sleepless nights and small milestones. Georgia learned to sketch with a baby in a sling against her chest, and Quentin brought Joseph to the livery when Georgia needed a break, the baby napping in a cradle Quentin had built and placed in the office. The townspeople doted on Joseph, and he grew into a happy, curious child. When Joseph was 14 months old, Georgia discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to expect, and their daughter arrived in early spring, screaming her displeasure at the world with impressive volume. "She has your determination," Quentin said, cradling the red-faced infant with the ease of experience. "And your lungs," Georgia replied, exhausted but happy. They named her Alina after Quentin's mother, and she proved to be as different from Joseph as night from day. Where Joseph had been easy-going and content, Alina was demanding and particular, knowing exactly what she wanted and refusing to settle for less. But she was also affectionate and quick to smile, and Quentin was completely wrapped around her tiny finger from the start. "We are outnumbered now," Quentin said one evening as he held Alina while Joseph climbed all over Georgia, both children clamoring for attention. "Do you mind?" Georgia asked, managing to tickle Joseph while keeping an eye on Alina. "Not even a little bit. This is everything I ever wanted." The years rolled on, filled with the beautiful chaos of raising children while building their lives. The livery continued to prosper, and Quentin's horse breeding venture proved successful, his stock gaining a reputation for quality throughout the territory. Georgia's portrait business grew as well, and she began teaching art classes to the children of Tucumcari, finding joy in passing on her skills. When Joseph was 5 and Alina 3, Georgia found herself pregnant once more, much to everyone's surprise. "I thought we were done," she told Margaret, half laughing, half exasperated. "Apparently not," Margaret replied, grinning. "How does Quentin feel about it?" "Delighted, of course. He would have a dozen children if I was willing." This pregnancy was the hardest yet, Georgia being older now and worn down from years of child-rearing. She was often sick and uncomfortable, and worried about the baby's health. Quentin hired a woman to come help with the housework and the children, insisting that Georgia rest as much as possible. "I do not like feeling useless," Georgia complained, stuck in bed on the midwife's orders during the final month. "You are growing our child. That is hardly useless." Quentin sat on the edge of the bed, holding her hand. Please just let yourself be taken care of for once." The baby, another boy they named Henry, arrived small but healthy, and George's relief was overwhelming. Henry was a quiet, watchful baby, content to observe the chaos of his older siblings with solemn eyes. As he grew, he showed an artistic bent that delighted Georgia, his chubby toddler hands drawn to charcoal and paper like metal to a magnet. Life in Tucumcari continued to evolve. New Mexico became a state in 1912, and Quentin and Georgia celebrated by taking the children to a statehood parade in Santa Fe, a journey that seemed impossibly cosmopolitan to Joseph and Alina, who had never traveled far from home. The automobile began to appear on the streets, strange mechanical beasts that scared the horses and fascinated the children. As their children grew older and more independent, Quentin and Georgia found time to reconnect as a couple, remembering what had brought them together in the first place. They would take evening walks alone, leaving the children in the care of a neighbor, and talk about everything and nothing. Sometimes Quentin would find Georgia sketching, and he would sit for her like he had that first time, and she would marvel at how much she still loved drawing him, at how his face had become even more dear to her with the passage of time. "Do you remember when you told me to draw you again but closer?" Georgia asked one evening as she worked on a portrait of him for their 15th anniversary. "I remember thinking I was being very bold," Quentin replied. "I had been working up the courage to talk to you for days. I had no idea. You seemed so confident. I was terrified. You were this sophisticated woman from the city, and I was just a cowboy who smelled like horse." He grinned at the memory, "But I figured I would regret it forever if I did not try. I am very glad you tried." Georgia set aside her charcoal, moving to sit in his lap. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me." "The feeling is entirely mutual, Mrs. Xavier." He kissed her, still with the same passion as when they were newly married. "Though I think our children might be the best things that happened to both of us." "That is true. We make beautiful babies. We do indeed." Joseph grew into a serious young man with his father's work ethic and his mother's eye for detail. He apprenticed at the livery, learning the business from the ground up, and seemed destined to take over the operation someday. Alina was bright and headstrong, determined to go to college despite the fact that few women from Tucumcari pursued higher education. She wanted to be a teacher, to bring learning to frontier communities, and both Quentin and Georgia supported her ambitions wholeheartedly. Henry remained the quiet artist, most content when he had paper and charcoal in hand, and Georgia nurtured his talent carefully, teaching him everything she knew. She saw in him the same passion for art that drove her, and wondered if he might go further than she had ever been able to, might study in real art schools and make a name for himself. As the children became young adults and began to make their own ways in the world, Quentin and Georgia found themselves with more time together. They traveled to St. Louis finally, when Georgia's father fell ill, and Quentin met her family properly at last. Her mother was still cool toward him, unable to fully accept that her daughter had married so far below her social station, but her father liked Quentin immediately, and they spent long hours talking about horses and business. "Your father is a good man," Quentin said on the train ride home. "I am glad we made this trip, so am I, and I am glad to be going home." Georgia leaned against his shoulder, watching the landscape roll past outside the window. "Tucumcari is where I belong. With me." "With you," she agreed, lacing her fingers through his. They celebrated their 20th anniversary with a party thrown by their children, now all grown or nearly so. Joseph had married a sweet girl named Annie and was running the livery with Quentin, planning to take over completely in a few years. Alina was enrolled at the Teachers' College in Santa Fe, coming home on holidays full of ideas and enthusiasm. Henry, at 15, was already showing promise as a portrait artist, with several commissions from wealthy families in Albuquerque. 20 years, Georgia said to Quentin as they danced together at the party, the same way they had danced at their wedding. Can you believe it? Some days it feels like a lifetime. Other days it feels like yesterday that I first saw you sketching me from across the street. You changed my whole life that day when you came over and spoke to me. You changed mine first by seeing something worth drawing. He pulled her closer. I love you, Georgia, more now than ever. I love you too, always. The years continued to pass, bringing both joy and sorrow. Walter died suddenly of a heart attack when he was 52, and Georgia grieved for her brother while supporting Margaret and their children through the loss. Quentin's business partner, Mr. Hutchins, passed away at a ripe old age, and Quentin and Joseph took over full ownership of the livery and stables, which had grown into one of the largest operations in the territory. There were grandchildren, too, as Joseph and Annie had 4 children in quick succession, filling the house with noise and chaos that reminded Georgia and Quentin of their own early years of parenthood. Alina eventually married a fellow teacher and settled in Albuquerque, bringing her children to visit Tucumcari every summer. Henry moved to San Francisco to study at an art academy, but wrote long letters home and sent paintings that Georgia framed and hung with pride. As Georgia and Quentin moved into their 50s, their love had deepened and matured into something unshakable. They knew each other's rhythms and patterns, could communicate with a glance, finished each other's sentences without thinking about it. They sat together on their porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the plains, holding hands and counting their blessings. You ever regret it? Quentin asked one evening. Leaving St. Louis, marrying me, settling here? Georgia looked at him surprised. Never, not for a single moment. Why would you ask that? I just want to make sure you have been happy, that this life has been enough for you. Enough, Quentin, this life has been everything. She squeezed his hand. I've gotten to spend every day with the man I love, raise beautiful children, create art that matters to people, build a home in a place I adore. How could that possibly not be enough? He raised their joined hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles. I am a lucky man. We are both lucky. We found each other. As they grew older still, moving into their 60s, their lives settled into a comfortable routine. Quentin had retired from the day-to-day operations of the livery, leaving it in Joseph's capable hands, though he still went by most days to check on the horses and offer advice. Georgia still painted and drew, though her hands were not as steady as they once were, and she had cut back on commissions to focus on her own artistic interests. They had 11 grandchildren now, ranging from newborns to teenagers, and the house was always full of visiting family. Georgia loved watching Quentin with the grandchildren, seeing the same patience and gentleness he had shown their own children. He taught them to ride, told them stories, built them toys and tree houses. The grandchildren adored him, and Georgia's heart swelled every time she watched him scoop up a little one or listen seriously to a child's rambling tale. On their 40th anniversary, the whole family gathered for a celebration. Joseph and Annie hosted at their large ranch house, and children and grandchildren came from all over New Mexico to attend. There was food and music and laughter, and Georgia looked around at the family they had created, the legacy of love they had built, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Alina stood up to give a toast. Her own children gathered around her. To my parents, who showed all of us what real love looks like, who taught us that marriage is about partnership and respect and choosing each other every single day. who built a life together based on mutual admiration and support. She raised her glass. May we all be so lucky in love. Everyone drank, and then Henry stood, having come all the way from San Francisco for the occasion. I want to add something. Mom, you taught me to see beauty in the world, to capture it and preserve it. You showed me that art matters, that creating something meaningful is worth dedicating your life to. And Dad, you taught me that strength comes in many forms, that being a man is about integrity and kindness, not machismo. You are both the reason I am who I am today. There were tears streaming down George's face by the time he finished, and Quentin's eyes were suspiciously bright as well. Joseph added his own words, talking about the business lessons and life wisdom Quentin had imparted. And then the grandchildren were clamoring to speak, each one sharing memories and love. When it was finally Quentin's turn, he stood and pulled Georgia up beside him, his arm around her waist. I am not much for speeches, he began, his voice roughened by emotion. But I need you all to know something. 40 years ago, I took the biggest risk of my life. I walked across a street and talked to a beautiful woman who was sketching me, and I asked her to draw me again but closer. And she said yes. That one moment of courage changed everything. Georgia, you have made every day of the past 40 years an adventure. You have challenged me, supported me, loved me even when I did not deserve it. You have given me children and grandchildren, a home, a purpose. You are my best friend, my partner, my love, and I would do it all again in a heartbeat. He kissed her in front of everyone, and the family erupted in applause and cheers. Georgia clung to him, overcome, whispering in his ear, I love you, I will love you forever. Forever sounds perfect to me, he whispered back. They danced together as the sun set, the same way they had done at their wedding, moving together with the ease of long practice. The years had changed their bodies, giving them gray hair and wrinkles and the aches of age, but the essential connection between them remained unaltered. They were still the young couple who had fallen in love over sketches and dumplings, still choosing each other every single day. As the evening wound down and family members began to depart for their various homes, Georgia and Quentin found themselves alone on the porch of Joseph's house, watching the stars emerge in the vast New Mexico sky. You remember the first time we looked at the stars together? Georgia asked, leaning against Quentin's shoulder. After our first supper at Mrs. Chen's, you were amazed by how many there were. I still am sometimes. I never get tired of this sky. Neither do I. He wrapped his arms around her, and they stood together in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the desert. The next several years brought the inevitable challenges of aging. Quentin developed arthritis in his hands, making it painful to work with the horses the way he once had. Georgia's eyesight began to fail, forcing her to give up detailed portrait work, though she still painted landscapes in bold, impressionistic strokes. They dealt with these changes as they had dealt with everything else in their marriage, with patience, humor, and unwavering support for each other. When Quentin had a scare with his heart, spending several days in the hospital while doctors worked to stabilize him, Georgia barely left his side. She held his hand through the worst of it, reading to him, talking to him, simply being present. When he was finally released to come home, she fussed over him relentlessly, monitoring his diet and making sure he took his medications. I am not an invalid, Quentin protested, though he accepted her care with good grace. I know. But you are my husband, and I nearly lost you, so you are going to have to tolerate me being overprotective for a while. He pulled her down to sit beside him on the sofa, tucking her against his side. I am not going anywhere. We still have years ahead of us. Promise. I promise. I am not done with you yet, George Xavier. They settled into a new rhythm, one that acknowledged their physical limitations while still embracing life fully. They spent long hours in their garden, which Georgia had cultivated over the years into a beautiful oasis of flowers and vegetables. They read to each other, sharing books and discussing ideas the way they had always done. They received visits from their children and grandchildren, and began to meet great-grandchildren, tiny beings who represented the continuation of the family they had started. On a crisp autumn afternoon, nearly 50 years after they had first met, Georgia set up her easel in their front yard. She had decided to paint Quentin one more time, wanting to capture him as he was now, with his silver hair and lined face and the wisdom in his blue eyes. Quentin settled into the chair she had placed for him, patient as always. "Are you going to sketch me from across the yard, or do I get to sit close again?" she laughed, delighted that he remembered. "Close, always close. I never want to be far from you." "Good answer." He watched her prepare her paints, mixing colors on her palette. "Do you ever think about that first day, when I caught you drawing me?" "All the time. I think about how brave you were, how you just walked right up and changed my whole life. I think about how you saw something in me worth capturing, worth keeping." Georgia began to paint, her brushstrokes sure despite her trembling hands. "You are still the most beautiful subject I have ever had, inside and out." The painting took several days to complete, Georgia working in short sessions when the light was right and her energy held. When she finally finished, she stepped back to examine it critically. She had painted Quentin in the golden afternoon light, sitting in his favorite chair with the New Mexico landscape stretching behind him. His face showed every year they had lived together, but also the strength and gentleness that had defined him from the beginning. "Come see," she called to him. Quentin came to stand beside her, studying the painting in silence. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Is that really how you still see me?" "That is exactly how I see you. Still the cowboy from across the street who stole my heart, just with more history written on your face." He turned to her, cupping her face in his weathered hands. "I love you, Georgia, more than words can ever express." "I love you too. Thank you for walking across that street 50 years ago. Thank you for asking me to draw you closer. Thank you for saying yes to all of it." They held each other as the sun began to set. Two people who had built a beautiful life together from a single moment of courage and connection. The years continued to pass, and though their bodies grew frailer, their love never diminished. They celebrated their 50th anniversary surrounded by 4 generations of family, a testament to the legacy they had created. Joseph gave a speech about the example his parents had set, about partnership and devotion, and choosing love every day. Elena read a poem she had written about their love story. Henry presented them with a collection of his paintings, each one depicting a moment from their life together. "You two are legends," one of the grandchildren said. "Everyone should be so lucky to find what you have." "It was not luck," Quentin said, his hand clasped tightly in Georgia's. "It was choice. Every day we chose each other. Every day we chose love. That is the secret." As they moved into their 70s, their health began to fail more seriously. Quentin's heart grew weaker, and Georgia developed respiratory problems that left her breathless and tired. But they faced these challenges together, as they had faced everything else. They moved into Joseph and Annie's house, unable to manage on their own anymore, but they insisted on sharing a room, on remaining together. "I cannot imagine sleeping without you beside me," Georgia said, as they settled into the room Joseph had prepared for them. "Then you never will," Quentin assured her. "We are together until the end and beyond." On a soft spring morning with wildflowers blooming across the plains and the windows open to let in the sweet air, Georgia woke to find Quentin struggling to breathe. She called for Joseph, who summoned the doctor, but they all knew the time had come. The family gathered around Quentin's bed, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all wanting to say goodbye. But Quentin only had eyes for Georgia, who sat beside him holding his hand, tears streaming down her face. "Do not cry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We had a beautiful life." "The most beautiful," Georgia agreed, lifting his hand to her lips. "Thank you for every moment of it." "Love you. Always. Always," she echoed. He smiled at her, the same smile that had made her fall in love with him all those years ago, and then he closed his eyes and slipped away peacefully, surrounded by the family he had cherished and the woman who had been his everything. George's grief was profound, a physical ache that never fully went away. She had lost her partner of more than 50 years, her best friend, the love of her life. But she was sustained by their children and grandchildren, by the memories they had created together, by the knowledge that their love had been real and true and lasting. She lived for 3 more years, spending her time painting and telling stories about Quentin to the younger generations, who had never known him in his prime. She made sure they understood what kind of man he had been, how he had loved fiercely and honestly, how he had built a life based on integrity and kindness. On an October evening, as the sun set in brilliant shades of gold and crimson over the New Mexico landscape she had come to love, Georgia passed away quietly in her sleep, a peaceful smile on her face. The family liked to imagine she had gone to find Quentin, to be reunited with the man who had asked her to draw him closer and had stayed close for the rest of their lives. They were buried side by side in the Tucumcari cemetery, under a shared headstone that read simply, "Quentin and Georgia Xavier, together always." And on Georgia's side of the stone, Joseph had added a small engraving of a sketch, a woman drawing a man, capturing the moment their love story had begun. The family continued to thrive and grow, carrying forward the legacy Quentin and Georgia had built. The livery business passed to Joseph's children, who modernized it into a successful horse ranch and training facility. Aliner's descendants became teachers and professors, spreading education throughout the Southwest. Henry's artistic talent echoed through the generations, with great-grandchildren becoming painters and sculptors and photographers. But more than any professional legacy, Quentin and Georgia had left behind a template for how to love well, how to build a partnership based on mutual respect and admiration, how to choose each other every single day. Their great-great-grandchildren still told the story of how they met, of the artist and the cowboy who found each other across a dusty street in Tucumcari and built a love that lasted a lifetime. In the house that Joseph's descendants still maintained, Georgia's paintings hung on the walls, particularly the final one she had made of Quentin in his old age. Visitors would stop to look at it, seeing the love captured in every brushstroke, the devotion evident in the way she had painted his face. And they would understand that this was what it meant to truly see someone, to truly love them, not despite their flaws and age, but because of the whole entirety of who they were. The story became part of Tucumcari's history, told to newcomers and tourists as an example of the romance of the Old West. But for the Xavier family, it was simply the story of their grandparents, their great-grandparents, the foundation upon which their entire family had been built. Years turned into decades, and still the story persisted. A local author wrote a book about their love story, interviewing the remaining people who had known them. The painting Georgia had done of Quentin that first day, when he had asked her to draw him closer, was donated to a museum in Santa Fe, where it hung with a placard explaining its significance as the beginning of a great American romance. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from one of their great-great-granddaughters, herself an artist. who recreated that first meeting in a mural on the side of a building in downtown Tucumcari. She painted a young woman with a sketchbook, sitting across the street from a young cowboy, the moment just before he would cross over and change both their lives forever. Underneath, she wrote the words that had started it all. "Draw me again, but closer this time." And every year on their anniversary, the family would gather at that mural, all the descendants of Quentin and Georgia Xavier, to celebrate not just their memory but the enduring power of love, courage, and the simple act of seeing someone truly and choosing to draw closer. They would tell the story again to the youngest generation, making sure it lived on, making sure that Quentin and Georgia's legacy of love continued to inspire and guide all who came after them. In the end, that was what mattered most. Not the business they had built or the art they had created, but the love they had shared and the example they had set. They had shown that true romance was not found in grand gestures or perfect circumstances, but in the everyday choice to see someone, truly see them, and to draw closer rather than pull away. It was in the accumulation of small moments, shared meals and held hands and quiet evenings watching the stars. It was in facing life's challenges together, supporting each other through grief and joy, sickness and health. Quentin and Georgia Xavier had lived an extraordinary, ordinary life, and in doing so, they had created something timeless. Their love story, which began with a sketch across a dusty street in Tucumcari, New Mexico, became a testament to the transformative power of connection, the courage it takes to approach someone and say hello, and the beautiful life that can unfold when two people choose to draw closer and stay close for all the years they are given. And so their story ended not with death but with legacy, not with an ending but with continuation through the lives they had touched and the family they had created. Somewhere in the vastness of whatever comes after, perhaps Quentin and Georgia were together still, walking hand in hand through fields of wildflowers under an endless sky, their love undiminished by time or distance, eternal as the New Mexico sunset they had watched together for more than 50 years. Their children and grandchildren and all who came after knew that what Quentin and Georgia had found was rare and precious, a love that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger. They had shown that it was possible to find your person, your partner, your home in another human being, and to build a life of meaning and beauty together. And it all started with a sketch, a cowboy, and the simple, brave words, "Draw me again, but closer this time." The family made sure that message lived on, passing it down through the generations as both a story and a lesson. Be brave enough to approach. Be willing to draw closer. Be open to love when it appears, even if it comes in unexpected forms. Choose each other, every day, through all the seasons of life. These were the gifts Quentin and Georgia had given to everyone who came after them, and they were gifts that would keep giving for as long as the family endured. In living rooms and around dinner tables, on front porches and in quiet moments, their descendants continued to tell the story, keeping their memory alive and their love eternal. And in Tucumcari, in the house that had been their first home together, now maintained as a family museum of sorts, Georgia's final painting of Quentin still hung in the place of honor. Visitors would stand before it, seeing the love and devotion captured in oil and canvas, and they would understand that they were looking at something sacred, proof that true love exists, that it endures, and that it all begins with the simple courage to draw closer to another human being and see who they truly are.